All right. Good afternoon, and welcome to Miss Walker's story time this afternoon. We are continuing along with our book, How to Train Your Dragon. We are picking back up with chapter, I think it's 16. Yep, 16, the fiendishly clever plan that goes wrong. So far, Hiccup's plan, remember, to get the green death and the purple death to fight each other, um, looked like it went okay. But when they turned around after they thought it was good, the green death started slowly moving. And so that is where we are starting from. So I am going to open up my screen so that you can see the ebook that I borrowed from our great public library, so that you can see the drawings as they pop up as I'm reading. So here we go. Chapter 16, the fiendishly clever plan goes wrong. So here was our last picture of Hiccup realizing that things were going wrong. Hiccup had been listening for Green Death's death song, but it wasn't singing it yet. The Green Death was dying, but he wasn't dead yet. What was he? What was a but he was, well, let me start that sentence again. What he was very, very angry indeed. Out of his bleeding mouth, he hissed weakly, "Where is he?" And then he heaved himself up on his feet and hissed a little more strongly, "Where is he? Where is my little supper? I knew I recognized him way down on my boom. No wonder. The little supper has made me a supper of me, the Green Death himself." As the dragon spoke, he was itching in. Let me try the sentence again. As the dragon spoke, he was inching forward, very slowly and painfully, his eyes fixed on the top of the cliff, where he could see little human beings beginning to run inland. The dragon threw back his head and screamed a blood-curdling scream of pure horrid revenge, dark and treacherous. "I'm supper him before I will go," and the dragon leaped forward. "Run!" shouted Hiccup, but everybody was already running as fast as they could. In the distance, Hiccup could see 400 warriors from the tribes of Hooligan and Meathead coming towards them from the highest point. They must have wondered at the boys' absence and had come to find them. But they won't get here in time, thought Hiccup. And even if they do, what can they do? Just then, the dragon landed with a crash on the cliff top, and suddenly the sun was blotted out. 20 boys ran towards the shelter of the ferns. The dragon picked up the nearest one with one claw and turned him over. It was Dog's breath. By the time the dragon had tossed him aside, muttering, "Not you," the other boys had disappeared into the bracken. The dragon was sick, but he laughed weakly. "You're not safe. Oh, no, for though I can't see you to kill you, I can use my fire." The bracken caught fire with the dragon's first breath, and the boys ran out of it as fast as they could. Hiccup stayed a little longer because he knew the dragon was waiting for him. Finally, the heat became unbearable, and he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and ran into the open. He had run hardly 100 yards before two of the dragon's talon closed around his middle and lifted him up, way, way up. So the other boys looked like little specks beneath him. The dragon held Hiccup in front of him. "We are both supper now, little supper," he said, and he tossed Hiccup high, high into the air. As Hiccup somersaulted for the second time, he thought to himself, "Now this is the worst moment of my life." Then he was falling. He looked down. There was the dragon's mouth, wide open with great, black, cavernous tunnel. He was going to fall into it. Chapter 17, in the mouth of a dragon. Hiccup fell into the dragon's mouth, and its teeth snapped shut behind him like prison doors. He was falling through complete darkness, surrounded by a smell so awful it was suffocating. He
Hello.
he jerked suddenly to a halt as the back of his shirt caught on something and held. Hiccup hung there in the darkness, swaying gently by 1,000 to 1 chance. His shirt had caught on a spear still stuck in the dragon's throat. It was his Roman banquet. Hiccup's foot brushed against the wall that he presumed was the dragon's throat. The dragon's digestive juices stung like acid as he snatched his foot away. Above him, Hiccup could hear the dragon's great tongue sloshing and lunging about his mouth, trying to find Hiccup so he could crunch him to death. He hadn't intended to swallow him whole. The disgusting river of green goo dripped down the puffy red insides of the dragon's throat. Just across from where Hiccup was hanging, a greeny yellow stream was puffing out of two small holes in the slimy wall. Every now and then there was a small explosion set with little flickers of flames shooting out of the holes.
Whoa.
How interesting, he thought. Guys, please be sure your microphones are muted for me. How interesting, thought Hiccup, who was strangely calm because he couldn't quite believe that this was happening. Those must be where the fire
Wait,
came
what?
from.
What?
The Viking biologist had wondered for years where fire that dragons breathed from had come from. Some had said the lungs, others the stomach. Hiccup was the first to discover the fire holes, which were too small to see with the naked eye and a normal sized dragon. Way down below him, Hiccup could hear the distant rumbling and singing from the dragon's previous meal. A sea dragon gigantus obviously takes a long time to digest, thought Hiccup. It was indeed still going strong. Humans can be bland, but if you have some salt to band, a little of brine, and they will make them taste divine. The spear was gradually bending over with Hiccup's weight. It was only a matter of time before it broke and he fell to join the breezy, optimistic in the stomach below. What was worse, the fumes and the heat and the smell were starting to confuse Hiccup, so he no longer really cared. The terrible noise of the dragon's heart beating had entered into Hiccup's chest and forced his own heart to follow the same rhythm. The dragon has to live after all, he found himself thinking. And he remembered the dragon's word to him as he stood on top of the cliff. You'll find that you come around to my point of view once you're inside me. Oh no, thought Hiccup, the dragon's digestion. It's already working. I need to live. I need to live, he repeated to himself over and over again, trying desperately to block out the dragon's thoughts. Then there was a horrible creaking noise as the stout Roman spear began to split in two. Oh no. Chapter 18, The Extraordinary Bravery of Toothless. Let's see if his dragon's going to save him. It would have been the end of Hiccup if it had not been for the extraordinary bravery of a certain toothless daydream. Toothless, if you would remember, had refused to join the battle with the death's oh, had refused to join the battle at Death's Headland. He intended to fly off somewhere. Oh, I lost my place. He intended to fly off somewhere down the coast a bit and lie low till it was safe again. He stayed at the highest point for a while, terrorizing birds and rabbits. He must have been having a lovely time doing this, for he did not hear the approach of Stoic and the entire tribes of Hooligan and Meathead until Stoic grabbed him around the neck. Where's my son? Asked Stoic. Toothless shrugged his shoulders rudely. Where's my son? Bawled Stork in an awesome, inspiring yell that had Toothless' ears trembling. Toothless pointed to Headland. Show me, Stoic said grimly. Under Stoic's eye, Toothless reluctantly flapped off towards Headland and followed by the two tribes. They arrived just in time to see the terrible monster throw Hiccup in the air and catch him in his mouth like a whelk. So much for the fiendishly clever plan, thought Toothless. He was about to use this opportunity of Stork's obvious distraction to sneak off to a place of safety when something stopped him. Nobody knows what that something was. It was a moment that changed the whole world and the view of the hooligan tribe. For centuries, we had believed it was impossible for dragons to consider a selfish thought or a generous action. But what Toothless did next is impossible to explain in being in his own best interests. All his fellow domestic dragons were flying somewhere over the inner ocean. As soon as they heard Fireworms cry desert, those who were hiding in caves between the crevices and crouched in the ferns rose up in a great swarm and abandoned their former masters as fast as their wings could carry them. The wild dragons from the Wild Dragon Cliff had left hours before, but something kept Toothless from flying after them. Maybe it was Stork's heart trendingly powerless cry no that caused him to pause. Or maybe somewhere in this self centered green dragon's heart of his, he really was fond of Hiccup and grateful for the hours he had spent looking after him, not shouting at him, telling him jokes, and giving him the biggest and juiciest lobsters. Dragons are selfish, argued Toothless with himself. Dragons are heartless, and we have no mercy. That's what makes us survivors. Nevertheless, something made him turn right around, and something made him fold his wings back and fly at the dragon in a blur to the great monster on the cliff tops. It was really not in Toothless' best interest, as I said before. Toothless flew right up to the monster's left nostril and started flying down, down inside his nose, tickling it with his wings. The sea dragon lunged up and down, wrinkling his nose like crazy, bellowing, ah, ah, ah. The creature stuck his great talon up his nose in a disgustingly fashion and tried to wrinkle out the tickling flea that was irritating. Toothless didn't get quite out of the way of the talon in time, and it scratched him on the chest. He hardly felt it, though. He was so excited. He carried on regardless, dodging the probing dragon claw. Ah, 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 bellowed the sea dragon. Meanwhile, Hiccup was being thrown this way and that inside the dragon's throat. As it shook its head from side to side, he was trying desperately to hang on to the spear, which was in danger of becoming dislodged at any second. Chew! The dragon finally sneezed, and Hiccup, the spear, Toothless, and a great deal of perfectly revolting snot were scattered all over the surrounding countryside. Toothless remembered he was shooting through the air that boys can't fly. So he folded his wings and dived after Hiccup, who was rapidly heading towards the ground. Toothless grabbed hold of Hiccup by the arm and tried to take his weight. Dragon's talons are extremely strong, and he was able to break Hiccup's fall. Not entirely, but enough so that when Hiccup crashed into the heather, he was traveling at reasonably slow. Stork came plunging frantically through the grass. He picked up his son and faced the monster, holding his shield over Hiccup's unconscious body. Toothless hid behind Stork. The Green Death had recovered from his sneezing fit. He shuffled forward, bleeding horribly from the fatal wounds in his chest and throat. He lowered his terrible head till it was on the level of the cliff, and his evil yellow eyes looked straight at Stork. Time for us, all of us, to die, purred Green Death. You can't save his life now, you know. You are quite helpless. My fire will melt that shield like butter. Green Death opened his mouth slowly, sucked in breath. Stork tried to grab chunks of feather to hold fast, but Stork, Hiccup, and Toothless were being dragged slowly but surely towards the gigantic tunnel that was the monster's open jaws. Green Death paused for a moment before he blew out again, enjoying their terror. This is what happens if you don't listen to Dragon Law, shrieked Toothless to himself in horror as he peered around the side of Stork's cloak. The monster puffed out his cheeks. Stork and Toothless waited for the flames to consume them, but no fire came out. The Green Death looked surprised. He puffed out his cheeks and blew a little harder. Again, no fire. He tried once more. Now his head seemed to be turning a strangest purple color in the effort of blowing, and it seemed to be swelling bigger and bigger, as if he was getting pumped up with air from the inside. The monster had no idea what was happening. He was thrashing around wildly. His eyes bulged larger and larger until, with a bang, he heard for hundreds of miles in every direction, the Green Death blew up right in front of their eyes. The green It may seem like some sort of miracle or intervention on the part of the gods, but the fact was a much more logical explanation. When Hiccup was hanging in the dragon's throat, desperately repeating, I need to live, to himself, he'd taken off his helmet and plunged the horns as hard as he could into the fire holes. It was a perfect fit. So when the dragon tried to use his fire, the blockage caused a buildup of pressure and eventually was so great that the green death simply exploded. Now, there were pieces of dragon flying in all directions. Storic and Toothless were incredibly lucky not to have been hit by anything, standing as they were so close to the explosion as they were. Not a single burning dragon's tooth hit at 8 feet long, exploded straight towards Hiccup. The boy was dragged under the shelter of Stork's shield by the intake of the monster's breath. It was now lying a couple of feet in front of Stork and Toothless, completely exposed. Stork caught the movement of the tooth out of the corner of his eye and flung himself and his shield forward. Only a Viking would have gotten there in time. Shooting wood with the bow and arrow development very quick reflexes. So Stork's shield did save Hiccup's life after all. If it had not been there, the tooth would have impaled Hiccup like a prawn on a stick. But as it was, it buried itself deep, deep into the bronze center of the shield and quivered there, blazing like a green edged in dragon flames. Stork lifted the shield, terrified that Toothless might be pierced through to his son, but Hiccup was unharmed. His eyes was opening and he was listening for something. He was listening for the strange sound that seemed to be coming from the flameless tooth itself. It was the sound of wheezing, echoing singing like the wind blowing in the coral caves. And it went something like this. I tell the mighty blue whale his life is over soon. With the swish of the armored tail, I put out the sun and the moon. The winds and gales are quivering when I begin to roar. The waves themselves are shivering and trembles to the shore. Listen, said Hiccup happily just as he passed out. The supper is singing. Chapter 19, Hiccup the Useful. 400 Vikings were now gathered on the cliff tops, broke into wild cheering for Hiccup the Toothless. They were strange, barbaric sight, all covered with disgusting green dragon snot and slime, but beaming and shouting with wild delight. All of those who had been saved from certain death. All around them, a terrible fight that had just taken place devastated the landscape. A choking green-gray smoke was hanging around, making it difficult to see, and great chunks of green Death's headland appeared to have been torn out by the fight. Avalanches of rocks were piled up on the beach. The terrible, monstrous corpse of purple death lay in deeper water. Bits of green death's insides and bones were scattered all over the place, while large sections of the heather and ferns were still in flames. However, by extraordinary miracle, nearly all the Vikings and their dragons had survived the dreadful battle. I say nearly all because when Toothless crept forward to lick his face on his master's licking fork, Stork noticed the ghastly wound on the dragon's chest, and it was pouring bright green blood. The talon of the green death had pierced the very heart that was supposedly heartless little dragon. Toothless followed Stork's gaze and looked down the first time, and he let out a squeal of terror and fainted dead away. 2 days later, Hiccup woke up, aching all over and very hungry. It was late at night, and he was laying on Stork's great bed. The room seemed to be crowded with a great deal of people. Stork was there, and Valhalla, and the old Wrinkly, and Fishlegs, and most of the elders of the tribe. There were dragons, too. Newt's breath and Hook Fang snapping and biting around Stork's legs. Harrow Cow was perched on the end of Hiccup's bed. The dragons had flown back as soon as they'd heard the explosion and realized their masters of Burke were masters once more. Being dragons, they had no explanation for their disappearance, but they did have the grace to look a little sheepish. He's alive, shouted Stork with triumph, and everybody began to cheer. Valhalla gave Hiccup a rousing punch in the shoulder, which is a Viking's mother equivalent of a really big hug. We're all here, said Valhalla, willing you to wake up. Hiccup sat straight up in bed, suddenly awake indeed. But you're not all here, he said. Where's Toothless? Everybody looked shiftily. Nobody would look at Hiccup. Stork cleared his son. I'm sorry, son, but he didn't make it. He died just a few hours ago. The rest of the tribe are giving him a funeral, hero's funeral at the moment. It's a great honor, he continued hurriedly. He'll be the first dragon to ever have been given a proper Viking burial. How do you know he's dead? Hiccup demanded. He said, well, no pulse, no breath, stone cold to the touch. He's quite clearly dead, I'm afraid. No, honestly, father, he said Hiccup in explanation. You don't know anything about Dragon. This could be a sleep coma. That's a good sign. That means he's killing himself. By Thor's whiskers, they started the funeral an hour ago. You have to stop them, yelled Hiccup. Dragons are only fairly fireproof. They'll burn him alive. Hiccup leaped out of bed with an amazing energy under the circumstances and ran out of the room and out of the house, followed closely by Fish Legs and Harrow Cow. Down the Hooligan Harbor was an awesome ceremony of the Viking military funeral was coming to an end. It was an incredible sight if Hiccup was in the mood for it. The sky was crammed with stars. The sea was glass flat. The entire tribes of Hooligan and Meathead were gathering motionless on the rock, every single person carrying a lighted torch in one hand. Even Snoutlight was there, looking solemn with his helmet off, with his head out of respect and his hair neatly brushed. Good riddance to Newt Wings, he said whisperingly to Dog's Breath the Dooligan, and Dog's Breath snivered. Serve him right for breaking the law, sneered Fireworm to Sleeslug, who was picking his nose. The replica of the Viking ship had been put out to sea and was drifting slowly away from the island of Burke along the path of the moon's reflection, just past the weird shakes of Stork's and Mulligan's burned out fleet. Hiccup could just make out the small body of Toothless laid out on the boat. Beside him lay Stork's shield and the dragon's tooth still stuck like a gigantic alien sword. Gobber the Belch sounded mournful signal of his horn as he was now completely recovered from his unexpected flight. Parp! 26 of Stork's finest archers, standing at attention at the right of the harbor, lifted their bows in the air. Every bow was loaded with an arrow in flame. No! Yelled Hiccup at his best yell he had ever yelled, but it was too late. The flaming arrows soared gracefully in the air. They landed on the ship and set it alight. Some of the crowd on the shore who turned upward, wondering who dared disturb the solemn ritual. Hiccup, shouted Thiggery the Meathead, joyfully recognizing the figure on the horizon. There was a mournful wonder as they whispered Hiccup to each other. Snoutlaw's jaws dropped open. He looked disappointed to see Hiccup very much alive and well. Snoutlaw could just about take Hiccup as a dead hero, but a living hero was something very different. Hiccup was watching the burning ship, tears pouring down his face. The boat tipped, and Stork's shield and tooth fell into the water. Just as the last piece of the boat was about to slip beneath the waves, consumed by fire and water, the flames reared up about 20 feet in the sky, and shooting out of the flames, wings spread like a phoenix. Trailing fire from his tail like a comet came Toothless. He soared high, high into the stars, leaving a path of flame as he flew. He dived down towards the sea, swooped at last minute to cries of wonders of the spectators. Hiccup was anxious he might be in pain until Toothless zoomed low enough and overhead for Hiccup to hear the dragon's rooster cry of triumph. Whatever Toothless' faults had been, and you might admire his sense of occasion, common or garden dragons were not normally known for their spectacular flying skills. But even a common or garden dragon could fly on fire, and it was in his spectacular in itself. Toothless burned through the night sky like a live firework, performing fiery somersaults and flaming loop-de-loops. The crowds who only a moment before were expecting to mourn the death of both Toothless and possibly Hiccup, were now beside themselves, hysterically cheering as Toothless showered them with sparks. At last the fire got too hot for him, and Toothless plunged into the sea, extinguishing himself, only to burst out again and fly straight to Hiccup's shoulder, where he acknowledged the wild applause with a solemn bows to his right and left, faintly spoiling his dignity with an odd cock-a-doodle-doo and a smug congratulations. Stork signaled for the crowd for silence, but he could only boom out following the speech at full blast. Hooligans and meatheads, terrors of the seas, sons of Thor's, the most feared dragon master, I humbly present to you the most recent member of the hooligan tribe. I give you my son, Hiccup the Useful. And the words Hiccup the Useful came echoing down the hills, and behind them shouted again in the cheering crowd as they were picked up and carried the night breeze, until the whole world seemed to be telling Hiccup that maybe he was going to be useful after all, and that his friends that might this hard way to become a hero. And that is the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed that book. Remember, it is part of a series. There's a whole, I think, 12 books in the How to Train Your Dragon series. So you all can check those out if you want. They are in our public library and you can get them as ebooks too. So don't go anywhere yet.